Welcome to Beyond the System with Dave and Josh.
Welcome to our inaugural episode of Beyond the System. My name is David Fauser.
And I'm Josh Bell, and we're your co-hosts for this podcast. We're here to cover a lot of information, but really it all comes back to our IMR strategy: inspect, maintain, replace. Dave and I have spent many years in the industry and many years with CIMCO, and we want to pass on our knowledge and information to help you maintain your systems better.
Yeah, so the essence of the series in itself is really like we're going to be taking a look at each piece of equipment in depth, and we're going to be taking a look at different brands, and we're going to be really diving in deep in regards to what should you be inspecting, what should you be maintaining, and finally, how do you plan for replacement eventually, and what replacement options could it look like? Could you save energy? Could you have better maintainability? Can you reduce your overall maintenance spend? And those are all the things that you can expect to get out of this. And we feel that the more that we share our knowledge, the better you'll be able to maintain your system, which is our ultimate goal. So Josh, we've been on the road a lot lately, eh?
Across the country almost. And everywhere we go, we've been talking a lot with our staff about this plan and how to implement this plan and how to better service our customers, because ultimately the IMR strategy really makes their job easier. I think that's fundamentally what it comes down to. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the problems that we often face is, as we start to talk technical to some, their eyes glaze over. And a lot of people we talk to actually are very technical. You talk to a lot of engineers, a lot of maintenance managers, but they have to be a jack of all trades, because not only do they have to know about our refrigeration system, their refrigeration system, they also have to know about all the other systems they have in place. And it would be actually impossible to be an expert at every single thing that they do. So really, if we could just help with these little areas, then we feel that we can maybe make their lives a lot more easier. For sure. So, it reminds me, Josh, of when we were actually preparing for this and thinking about it, and it just makes you think about a lot of the old stories about how sometimes we have to respond to emergency service, and one that comes to mind is a few years ago where we had to retube a shell and tube chiller on the fly. We had a call, chiller failed. Right during the Christmas holidays, couple major tournaments, and their chiller had failed, and they said, "Hey, you got to get over here right away." And when we get that call, it's all hands on deck. We got our mechanics working 24/7. We're flying parts in. It's like we've got our service department engaged on this. We're making site visits. Our customer had various levels of staff involved, and all this communication plan. And I mean, really, was an immense amount of work and immense amount of cost when something like this happens. And, we pulled it off in record time. We had two of our best guys who are experts at doing retubing. And it worked so well that the mayor of the city actually had a party for us. And we all went over, and it was pretty awesome. We're patting each other on the back, and the town was very appreciative, et cetera, et cetera. But, it's great. But in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, had there been a better replacement plan in place, maybe we would have replaced that component maybe 2 years earlier, and maybe it would have been maybe a third of the cost, Josh, maybe even less than that.
Yeah, I mean, and we typically only analyze the disruption from a cost perspective on our end, Dave. Like, we can't even imagine what the cost disruption was on their end. Possibly canceling the tournaments, moving stuff around. I remember that like it was yesterday. Right through the Christmas holidays, likely the busiest middle section of the season for an ice rink, and they were completely down for about 3 weeks. So, I can only imagine the disruption on their end. The use of resources, the repurposing of resources. No different than us. And I mean, it's fine to look back, and we all did a great job, but did we have to go through that? Did we need the disruption? I would think you'd agree that we do not need the disruption.
No, I mean, it's not good for anybody.
Mm-hmm.
With these situations, and yet we find ourselves in these situations 20% of the time. 20% of what we do is emergency response, which we're there for our customers, but I'd say 100% of those emergency responses could have been prevented through a proper inspection, maintenance, and replacement plan.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, so that's the whole philosophy of this entire thing. Like, it's when we talk about inspect, maintain, replace, we know that there's not a standard approach that everybody follows. I mean, there's so many different dynamics where your plant is, the competency of your staff, what's required by the local inspectors. And then there's the philosophies of companies. There's a lot of different approaches, a lot of different philosophies we come across, right, Josh?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we have customers that well maintain their equipment. We have customers that honestly just find it hard to afford to maintain their equipment. And, you know, sometimes they are putting out fires in other areas of their business. And, you know, that's okay too. There's still a lot that can be done without spending a lot. And, you know, the IMR process, if followed, you know, is easy because it budgets, you know, you're consistent. You don't have those big surprise costs as often as you would if you don't follow anything. So, you know, often people think that can't afford it, that they can't afford it, but really they're spending more over time. So, you know, some run to failure, some balance hours, you know, there's all kinds of ways to think about it. But, you know, the key is to just have a consistent plan that you follow, whether you want to run to failure, whether you want to over maintain. I mean, you know, all of them can weigh in benefits, but a consistent plan that's proven really across the industry, you know, I mean, that's what we want to share, right? Like, what are industry best practices? What should the plan really, really look like so that you're not there on an expensive breakdown, or you're not over maintaining, or, you know, you're not running to failure and then having to scramble for budget. You're well prepared. You have asset plans in place. You know, really, it's an all-encompassing discussion.
Yeah, and that's the thing. And with refrigeration, as you know, it's like the silent killer is that the refrigeration system just works harder, right? So if you know your condenser builds up debris in it or scaling, then it just works harder, which ultimately just costs more. So the irony of the situation that if it's not done properly, you either pay more in energy costs, or obviously you're going to just pay more when the maintenance just schedules itself, and it's mechanical equipment.
Yeah, and you know, just to add to your comment, you know, the condenser is such a great way to realize that point you're trying to make, because so often the energy overage is consumed all year round, but people only notice when the season drastically changes. Meanwhile, all that time that they assume everything was fine, it's really only because the system's designed to operate in those high temperatures. And when it's not there, then it becomes, you know, more efficient. It doesn't bother them. It doesn't let them know, hey, you know, my condenser's fouled, my water pump's not working, my belts are slipping. It's not something that's observed when it's 10 degrees outside and the system's just purring along, so they think. Meanwhile, the energy being consumed is higher, and it's higher, and it's a lot higher. And let's be honest, energy costs nowadays, they're a bit of a silent killer, you know, and you think you're saving, meanwhile you're spending every hour of the day, you know. So using the condenser analogy is great because, you know, I always said when I was in the truck, you know, high temperature and low temperature, that's when I get the most of my calls. You know, the pesky water leak outside doesn't show up until it's -10 outside, and then it's a big problem. You know, and the loose belts and scale, they don't show up till it's 34 degrees outside. Then now it's a problem. So, you know, maintaining throughout the year, doing multiple visits, doing multiple checks, whether you're paying for them, doing them yourself. Again, have a plan, have the framework in place so that you don't run into those problems.
Okay, well, let's get into that framework, Josh. And the first part of the IMR is the inspection part of it. And so, just to be clear, as we're talking about this philosophy, this is not something that you need to go run out to a contractor and say, I need a mechanic here every day. A lot of this stuff can be done by you or your staff if given the proper direction. So let's first of all, okay, let's pretend I'm a new plant manager, okay? And I've just walked into the plant and I say, okay, how do I make an inspection plan?
Yeah. So, I mean, initially, and in most cases, every plant has, you know, logbook, checklists, you know, religiously do those. And, you know, I think every 2 hours is a great number as long as you have staff in the building. If you don't have staff in the building, there are a lot of systems out there across North America where they are not staffed. And, that way, in those cases, it's often better to reach out to a contractor that they can just stop in and do regular visits, obviously not 2 hours a day, but when they're unmanned, it's nice to have somebody with a high level of knowledge to do a thorough inspection daily, weekly, monthly, whatever you feel like. But when it's your own staff, I used to do, a bit of a training course for one of the major cities in Canada. And the one thing that I told all of them, because it almost felt like some of them were mailing it in a bit, they were just, they had an easy day at work. And I said, I don't want to overcomplicate things for you. All I want you to do is come and look at the equipment. Like, have your checklist, but show up and look. And, what the benefit to that is you get accustomed to the sound of the equipment. You get accustomed to the visual appearance of the equipment. And all I wanted them to do at the lowest, easiest level, if you want to say, is know the difference between what good looks like and what a problem might look like. And, if I go to a condenser, for example, and the belts are squealing or there's water frozen to the roof, I want to know. So if, the role that you play in your organization isn't a role to correct the issue, that's okay. But identify the issue and notify whoever is responsible, because the issues that can arise from these small things can get quite large. Roof collapse, belts breaking on a condenser. That's a cheap one. If your bearings go because your fan blades get frozen solid and they break apart, now you need fans and wheels and shafts, and on it goes. So, just show up at the most basic level, do your log, have a look, have a listen, and then notify people when you identify things that are out of the norm.
So if I wanted to put together a regular, like a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly inspection plan, how do I do it?
I mean, I think if you're starting with very little knowledge, I think consulting a contractor at that point would be a very good path forward. In the industries throughout North America, there are organizations that also can support with basic logbooks, and in a lot of cases, it's also local authorities having jurisdiction that have requirements for them to meet. So I think that would be the basics to start there. Either local authority, local organization, or directly to a contractor. Get there, get a list of equipment that needs to be observed, maintained, watched, and then create the checklist from there. And the checklist, the most basic things that should be there no matter what are runtime of equipment, pressures of the system, oil pressures on compressors, highly critical. If you don't have ways to check suction pressure, discharge pressure, oil pressure on all your compressors, then you've got to get a contractor in to give you those tools so you can observe those things, because those are definitely the basics.
Right. So it's almost like your body, in a sense, that you're going in for a bit of a health check, and you're seeing like you're getting a blood test essentially, and you're seeing, oh, that's off or that's changed. Why?
Yeah, absolutely. And without knowing the baseline or what good looks like, you don't know, right? You think you're healthy. Another good one to have is your secondary coolant system. If you have brine or glycol, or you need to know what that stuff should operate at, so that when you are doing your checks, you can compare to what good looks like. And often that's a miss in general logbooks. Usually, when you come in, when I was on the tools, I'd come in, I'd go to the logbook. I'd want to see, what did the history look like? And, often people don't know what good looks like. It's a nice thing to have on your page. And, you buy a generic logbook, you won't always find this, but, to know where the pressure should be is a good way. I used to even label some of my gauges with like a range, so that people would go in, as long as their pressures are in the range, that they're okay. But if they don't know, it's hard to know. But if you don't know, keep that logbook. When there is an issue and a technician shows up, they can look through the history and they can almost pinpoint the time where the belts broke off the condenser, if it's in the winter, or the pump stopped working because the coupling is no longer working, all these things. So all those details are good to keep on file, but having somebody come in and set that baseline initially really helps kick off the whole inspection process.
Yeah, like and it's hard sometimes, because I think often when I'm talking to like a national account, like a big food and beverage type of company, and they want to know, well, give me our inspection plan, and the problem is that every single plant is different, and they have different components, and different ages and different, there's just so much different that it really, I mean, I guess the point is that it's got to be customized, and then work with your local contractor or somebody to help you put together the list and how you're going to track it. It's pretty straightforward. Moving on then to like maintenance. So like maintenance is interesting because there's predictive maintenance, and then there is unusual sort of maintenance that comes up. Like it's like changing tires on your car. You don't do it every year, but you do it when you maybe every 4 years. And then you've got emergency response. So is maintenance similar to inspection in the sense that everything is customized? Like how, like if I was running the plant and I wanted to put a budget together, do I just carry the same number every single year, or how would I do that?
Yeah, I mean, if I was running a plant, as the plant ages, I would be slightly increasing my budget, no different than inflation. I mean, certain tasks will cost the same, but let's just use overhauling a compressor, a reciprocating compressor as an example. When the compressor is early in life, the likelihood of changing major components is pretty low, especially if you stay on the serviceable wear items like springs and valve rings and piston rings and stuff like that. But over time, regardless, you're eventually going to get into cylinder sleeves and oil pumps and stuff like that. So, you want to be ready for those. If well maintained and you do good oil changes, maybe you can avoid a lot of those. But, from a budgeting perspective, over time, you want to slightly keep an increase, maybe a bit of a reserve. But a lot of the regular routine maintenance, the pricing is going to be consistent, or the cost will be consistent. I mean, to change a pump coupling is a pump coupling. It's going to be, whatever it is, $50, $75 for a chunk of rubber every season. I used to do them every season as a cheap insurance policy because, the worst service calls is when you get called out on Christmas Eve because a $50 chunk of rubber broke and now it costs $600 to change it, So there's a lot of those items that are almost fixed cost and fixed, actions you could take that will stay consistent. But the bigger items, they sort of grow over time just because we have moving parts that are wearing against non-moving parts, and eventually they're going to hit. But it's not something that buries anyone. And the one thing to look at is as you're increasing your service costs over time, you may want to look at replacement, right? And I know we're not quite there yet, but we'll talk a bit more of that in a minute. But between the age of the equipment, the way you operate the equipment, how often equipment starts and stops, Dave, is a major contributor to the amount of wear that it sees. And that's why when we have a reciprocating machine in an ice rink, for example, it almost gets more wear than a reciprocating machine in a cold storage plant or a food processing that never stops. It's that stop and start that really hits you. And so, having good controls in place and, making sure you're optimizing the way you operate your system is always, an effective way to save a few dollars over the life of the plant.
Yeah, I mean, it's this fine line though, like with not maintaining, and then I see a lot where, we respond to, let's say, a service contract RFP, and sometimes I look at it and go, holy cow, like this is like, they're trying to just schedule all of this maintenance every single year that really isn't required because it almost becomes a waste of money. So there's this sort of sweet spot in the middle with not over maintaining, but not under maintaining. And I think that requires at least look every like once or twice a year, specifically around your budget time, because you want to make sure you're aware of these things.
Yeah, so one of the things that I always liked when I was doing service work was when I had a customer that would participate, I guess you could say, where I would bring them suggestions and they would follow them. And then over time, because let's be honest, when I was young in the game, I was making suggestions that were kind of told to me without really proving it to myself, and not a lot has changed. I mean, we're still putting in the same similar pieces of equipment that we did years ago. And, one of the customers that I had specifically in a large municipality, I said, how often do you want me to come here? And they said, well, it'd be nice if you came every 3 months, because then, I'm going to notice things that they're not. And I said, okay, well, why don't we do this? Let's set up your maintenance. Let's do, 2 oil changes a year, and one could be on an overhaul and one could be just on its own. And let's see how your system operates by doing that. And, so to me, not that I needed more work, but, I just wanted to make sure that I was there for them. And so we started doing that. And then, over the years, the trust started to build between us. And, I said to the manager one day, like, so how have things been going, like, since we've been kind of doing this every 3-month visit? He said, man, my cost overall has come way down. He said, when you first pitched it to me, I thought you were just trying to get here every 3 months. He said, but we bought in and my costs are way down. I don't have breakdowns, and even if they had something that they needed me to look at, if it was minor, it was just on the list for me to look at the next 3 months, So um, what we accomplished was we maybe over maintained on the oil change based on hours. That's all we did, was based on hours. But if you read a book, maybe we were over maintaining on the oil change, but wow, the benefits of the overhaul were huge. So, it's almost like there's certain aspects of maintenance where you maybe want to push a little bit beyond what the suggestion is. And then there's others where you don't. So, by pushing a little on the lower cost oil change, we saved on the major cost of overhaul. So, kind of over maintain on one, and then the benefit was a bit of under maintaining on another, is what the final end product was, and at the end of the day. But another thing that I noticed from my experience is, you've got places that just put equipment on schedules for maintenance, and really you don't always need it that way. In the old days, if you look in the old manuals, it was on hours or seasonally. And often the seasonal maintenance is still a great time to do it because you're down and you have the time to do it. So that's when maybe a little bit of over maintaining is a benefit, because you don't have contractors in your building while you're trying to use the building for what it was designed for. So it's a delicate balance. You don't want to over maintain and waste your money. You don't want to under maintain and cause unscheduled maintenance. So there's a good balance. So working with contractors, Dave, watching our show, getting the tips,
Yeah.
listening to our podcast, like, this is a place you can get that advice from, and it costs you nothing but time.
Okay, so diving into the replacement side of things, so we've covered, like, how to inspect and how to maintain, but now you're getting to some components that are end of life cycle, and this becomes a little bit more tricky because there's these life cycle analysis out there, similar like ASHRAE, et cetera, that would say, okay, this has to be replaced or should be replaced after 25 years, but it's very prudent that that's obviously a beacon, or that's an anchor point, but then you can really look at components and say, what's the condition of this? How has it been maintained? And I think also with this whole replacement, you got to be looking at things on a pretty long horizon, as well as incorporating some of your corporate strategies that could involve energy reduction or refrigerant reduction or scalability and those sort of things. So I often find that the ideal time to look at one of these energy projects is when you are planning to replace a piece of equipment. So anyways, I've sort of talked about a lot of different sort of things with replacement. Josh, why don't you provide some more details in regards to sort of what best in class customers would do from a replacement strategy?
Yeah, I would say, it varies. The best in class customers really do stick to the industry guidelines. And there's a few non-negotiable pieces of equipment, especially in our world. Shell and tube chillers, they're kind of a non-negotiable. They're like a necessary. I mean, obviously you need a way to get the heat out of your secondary fluid. So they're kind of a necessary instrument to make the system run efficiently. But what people don't realize, you don't open them, you don't inspect them, especially on a calcium chloride system, brine system. You wouldn't want to open it because adding air into the system just creates more havoc. But, as the seasons go, the tubes eventually, they get scaled up, they get dirt on them, they get anything you can think of. So those ones are kind of a non-negotiable because you just don't know when it's going to go. So, that 20-25 year mark is where everybody should be looking to change those heat exchangers. And the cost of a failure is just so expensive because you contaminate the secondary fluid. Now you have disposal costs, you have emergency costs, you have lost use of your building costs, and then you have equipment rush cost. And, just so the world knows, they're not 100% custom, but there's many variations of these pieces of equipment and to have one sitting on the shelf is pretty rare. We try to keep a few in our inventory, but it's hard. It's hard to get the one that aligns best, especially if it's more than a single pad rank. They're just too big to hold in inventory. So the second non-negotiable for me is really your condenser. I mean, if it's well maintained with a good chemical treatment company, going by the industry standards, it's still something that you shouldn't pass up on. You talk about efficiency, Dave. That's probably the biggest killer of efficiency is a condenser with scale on it. Once those tubes get scaled up, you can't recover. The one piece of equipment that you can track a lot of maintenance, and a lot of maintenance gets done on, is usually your compressors. So, if they have been maintained well, obviously we can look at that. Going by industry standards like ASHRAE, like you mentioned, that is really the benchmark anchor. That's not just average Joe opinions like you and me, Dave. That's a collection of, some of the continent's finest engineers saying that over a period of time, this is what we've discovered, so it's a good plan to stay with. If you can budget for it, it's great. If you can afford it, it's amazing. And, a lot of these other worries, they come off your plate, but
First of all, I'm a big believer that the contractor you're working with should be helping you with this. Often we see maybe some outside firms that companies hire to help them with this, but really I feel it's value added that should be done. And really, if I was running the plant with these components, thinking about it from a more critical perspective, what's my business risk if this fails? And how fast can I replace it? What's my operational risk? And what is my safety risk? Would be all things that I'd really want to fully understand, so I can help communicate that with the corporates or the financial side of things, the owner, so that they understand those risks. Because the refrigeration system in probably 99.9% of the places that we service are mission critical. And without it, your business is severely disrupted. So I can't stress enough how important it is to have these replacement plans in place. And I also can't stress how important it is to understand how you can get some of these things funded, right, Josh?
yeah, absolutely. There's often help out there. There's a lot of grants, especially for equipment that ages over that 20-year mark. Like not everything, but a lot of things can be tied back, like you mentioned a few times, about energy savings. And as time goes by, things get developed that save a lot of energy. There's also ways where you can add additional components that now turn a system into a more energy efficient system, which opens the door up to a lot of grants. So, grants are a great way. I know in our company, we have a team that can help with that. I would hope that most contractors do. And that is something that should be on the table when major components are being discussed.
Yeah, because when we respond to emergency service, it's like for like, because we don't have time. But when you're 2 or 3 years ahead, you can sit back and ponder and challenge and say, do we want to reduce our ammonia charge or our refrigerant charge? Do we want to plan for some future expansion? All of these things. And so I would always challenge anybody who's putting a plan together to see what can be done, because that's most of the time is the only time these business cases make sense, is when there's an end of life project in place. And you might be surprised. I mean, to go to a larger condenser, let's say, that would maybe reduce your head pressure, is not that much money. Like, it's actually pretty minuscule if you're already spending the money. It's a lot of money if you want to replace a good piece of equipment and then add some additional capacity. But if you're already replacing it already, it might be like a couple of percentage points sometimes. I'm always surprised with what the next size up actually costs. And it's not as much as you think it is.
Yeah, even on the compressor front, like reciprocating compressors, I mean, come on, there's so many out there. So often you could go up to a larger piston size and run possibly the same horsepower that might give you a little bit more capacity, but in the end, the wear and tear on the equipment is so much lower that the life of that piece of equipment extends so far out, because you're not putting the pressure on it like you are on a high speed, smaller piston machine. So there's all kinds of ways to look at all kinds of things. One thing I just want to make sure we definitely mention when we're talking about upgrades in our system, controls have to be one of the biggest ones, Dave. I mean, if you're still running on a Honeywell T775, Old Faithful, it's a great, reliable device, you're missing out on all the benefits beyond the energy, the trending, the knowledge of your system. It's almost like hooking up a heart monitor to your body for the life of the system. And when you talk about energy grants, just by putting in the next level of automation, you can get floating head pressure control and pump cycling and all these benefits that you just can't have, and they get often overlooked because it's not a 5-alarm fire major piece of equipment. It can run on Old Faithful all day long, and they're great and they're simple, but what are you missing out on, right?
100%. Yeah. So as a end user out there, challenge whoever's putting this asset report together. What else could be added as well?
Mm-hmm.
And what's the business case of that? So a lot of dynamics there. So yeah, so we've covered like inspection, maintenance, replacement, and obviously it goes without saying that CIMCO can help with that. But I think there's a lot of really capable contractors out there that could help you with that as well too. So just it's like, my philosophy, our philosophy as an organization is we really don't care if you do it or we do it, or whoever. We just want to make sure it gets done. But this is all really common sense. Like, it's very common sense what we're talking about today. Of course you want to inspect, of course you want to maintain, and of course you want to have a replacement plan. But why is it so often overlooked?
I think at the end of the day, most people, they, including us, Dave, like, you think about our vehicles, we do our best, right? But if it starts and drives and gets us where we got to go, maybe there's some stuff wrong with it, but not a high priority for us, right? Because we need the vehicle to go from here to there. No different than we need our refrigeration plant to keep our ice or keep our freezer or, whatever we're doing with it. So I think, most people in business, except for those big, large industrial plants that have, operating engineers dedicated to focus on the system, it just gets overlooked. If I'm a manager of a recreation facility, I probably have more people banging on my door about, issues with the building than issues with the refrigeration plant. So, often I fall into this trap. I would fall into this trap, or our, people in our industry fall into the trap of, it'll kind of let me know, it'll let me know when it's not right.
Wrapping it up, Josh, if there's one thing that people should be taking away from this today, what should that be?
I would say it comes back to that simple, just do something, right? Do something, get a plan together. And, I think if you do something, you get a plan together, you get the basics set, you're going to see the benefit, and then you're going to want to dive in even deeper and make sure that your system's on track so that, it doesn't have to be the thing you worry about every day.
Perfect. Well said. So yeah, so I hope you found this podcast valuable today, and we hope that you join us on this journey of diving into all these components. And even if it's not a component in your plan, listen anyways, because you're going to pick something up. And feel free to reach out, like and subscribe to our podcast, and reach out if you have any questions or comments. Josh and I are here to help answer those. And it really is one of our passions, this industry, and making sure we support our industry and our customers. Have a great day, and from Beyond the System, we'll talk to you next time.